This GeekWire podcast is brought to you by BECU. Stay tuned to the break as Brian Westbrook interviews BECU's Stacy Black about minimizing the impact of uncertain times on your financial health. For more money hacks, check out geekwire.com/BECU. Coming up this week on the GeekWire podcast, Google prepares to say goodbye to Seattle's Fremont neighborhood. We get ready to say farewell to Skype, and we take a quantum leap with one of Microsoft's top technical leaders in the field. Welcome to GeekWire. I'm GeekWire co-founder Todd Bishop.
And I'm GeekWire editor Taylor Soper.
We are coming to you from Seattle, and specifically from Fremont, Seattle's Fremont neighborhood, where we get to report each day on what's happening around us in business, technology, and innovation. What happens here matters everywhere, and every week on this show, we talk about some of the most interesting stories and trends in the news. Taylor, it was a busy news week right at the end of the week. And in fact, later on, I've got an interview that I recorded with the head of Microsoft's quantum hardware division. We're going to have that later on in the show. But so much happened here right at the end of the week that I wanted to have you jump on and talk about it. How's your week going?
It's been great. Busy. I moderated a panel with some Seattle area investors. The event was hosted by TIE Seattle. It's an entrepreneurship group here, and got a lot of great insights into the world of startups and early stage venture capital. And of course, we talked about AI and agents and dynamic pricing models and DeepSeek. But then, the conversation got into just, what are the fundamentals of these startups? And I made the observation that, hey, we could be having this conversation in 2007 and it would be the same. And the investors all kind of agreed, it was, do you know your customer? Do you have domain expertise? Do you have a sound business model? So there's a lot of noise, I think, with this AI stuff, and clearly it's changing how companies are built and the business models. But at the end of the day, you got to make revenue and you got to eventually turn a profit. So those things don't change.
By the way, you might hear some noise in the background. That is our colleague John Cook in the midst of the judging process with our outside third-party experts for the upcoming GeekWire Awards. What's happening is the nominations have been made, and they're now determining the finalists that will go back to the public for the GeekWire Awards, which are coming up on April 30th. So be sure to check out geekwire.com/events for details on that, plus our Microsoft at 50 event, which is coming up on March 20th. And by the way, I can say, as a little bit of a sneak preview, we've confirmed Brad Smith, Microsoft's president, and Nathan Myhrvold, Microsoft's former CTO, known for many other things, as the rest of the lineup for our March 20th Microsoft at 50 event, joining former Microsoft CEO Steve Ballmer. So you can check that out also at geekwire.com/events. We are, as I said, in Seattle's Fremont neighborhood. And over the years, it has been an attractive hub for major tech companies, most notably perhaps Google, which has been here for almost 2 decades here in Fremont. And there was some big news this week with Google and Fremont.
Our neighbor is vacating, and the big news that we broke here at GeekWire is that Google is leaving Fremont and consolidating to the South Lake Union neighborhood, which is, of course, the home of Amazon's headquarters, but also a large Google Cloud office, which now seems to be maybe the Google Seattle office itself.
That's right. And for me, this was a fascinating one, in part because Google is still very much a hybrid environment in contrast with Amazon, as an example. They're allowing employees to be in the office some days, allowing them to work remotely other days. And it seems like that's having an impact on the demand for office space. And I can imagine they look around most days, probably both South Lake Union and Fremont, and just don't see a full office. And so with that in mind, especially in this era of cost consciousness, trying to save every penny to put toward data centers and capital expenses for artificial intelligence, I can see where you've got these different trends and different pressures that are causing companies, including Google, to really ask whether they need all of the office space that they once had.
So Google already has a presence in Kirkland, Washington, which is on the east side of the Seattle region. That's where they first planted their flag here in the Seattle area. And so to me, this is not so much as Google's downsizing in Seattle or reducing their presence here. It seems to be, to your point, they're probably saying, why do we have so much of this space? And so my big question is, who's going to come in? And I have a theory for you, Todd.
Oh, I like it. I think I know who you might say, but I don't want to preempt you. So go ahead. Who do you think?
OpenAI.
Oh, interesting. That's not where I was headed. Keep going.
I've heard from a couple sources that they are looking for a lot of space here in the region. Now, they already have planted a flag on the east side of Seattle. We reported on that earlier, but I've heard they're looking in the realm of six-figure square footage space.
Which this would be.
And
More than 100,000 square feet.
Of course, they're a growing company. They have a lot of money. There's a lot of talent here in Seattle. They've got a big partnership with Microsoft. They probably want to expand their footprint here in the region. And so whether it's OpenAI or another tech company, or maybe it won't be a tech company, I don't think that space will be empty for long. To your point, it's a great location. I mean, beautiful area, proximity to the city. What did you have in mind?
I was thinking NVIDIA. Because, they're already in the neighborhood, not in that specific location, but they acquired Octo AI. I could see them tapping into the fact that the region is becoming a little bit more of a chip-making region when you look at what Amazon and Microsoft are doing, although that's maybe a bit of a stretch. That said, very much along the same lines in terms of the AI boom, fueling the next wave of engineering centers here from out-of-town tech companies. I think it makes total sense.
Yeah. Stay tuned.
That's right. In the meantime, as you said, Google is saying they remain committed to their long-term presence in Seattle, and they're just focused on investing in real estate efficiently to meet the current and future needs of our hybrid workforce. So you can see in all of those words in the statement from the Google spokesperson exactly what's going on there. And I think it's just all about efficiency and making the most of the space they have, but not shrinking their presence here by any means, which is in the thousands of employees and has been for many years. Okay, coming up next, we say goodbye to Microsoft Skype. This GeekWire podcast is brought to you by BECU. Stay tuned as Brian Westbrook interviews BECU's Stacy Black for today's Money Hack about minimizing the impact of uncertain times on your financial health. And for more money hacks, check out geekwire.com/BECU.
How do uncertain times affect your financial health? I'm Brian Westbrook, host of Money Hacks presented by BECU, joined by Stacy Black, lead financial educator for BECU. The world around us is changing, Stacy. What do we do?
Yeah, we need to stay focused on what we can control. It's really volatile right now and there's not a lot we can control. So focus in on what you have control over and look for resources. BECU has great resources for our members, so check with your financial institution and see how they can help. And remember to stay focused on your financial goals. That's why we're going through this work.
We'll have more on this topic, including the latest on student loan forgiveness and what we should do when this topic keeps changing in the world around us. Thank you, Stacy. For more on this topic, visit Money Hacks at geekwire.com/BECU.
Listen to the full interview and find more episodes of Money Hacks at geekwire.com/BECU. And find more information at becu.org. Welcome back. It's Todd Bishop with Taylor Soper. Tell me what this sound conjures up in your emotions in your heart.
Iconic sound. It's sitting at your laptop or maybe your desktop and waiting for someone to pick up the phone.
It's funny. Wait a second. I'm trying to remember. It's been so long since I've used Skype. Do you hear that sound when you call out? Or do you hear it when somebody's calling in? Or is it both?
I think it's both.
Yes. Okay. Because I got to say, for me, it's a little bit stress-inducing because it feels like I've got a call from somebody that I maybe don't really want to get. I don't know. Maybe I've got a weird association with a past bad experience, but it certainly is iconic. That, of course, is the Skype ringtone. And Microsoft acquired Skype back in 2011 for $8.5 billion. It was the largest acquisition by Microsoft at the time. It's since been surpassed by LinkedIn and Nuance and Activision Blizzard. But at the time, this was a huge deal. And the news this past week was that Microsoft is finally saying goodbye to Skype, or as you put it in your story, Taylor.
Hanging up on Skype. Yeah, it's fun looking back at the history of this company. I mean, when it launched in 2003 and the subsequent years, it was, I think revolutionary is a proper word to use. It really changed how people communicated over the internet, especially for folks if you wanted to do that international call and you didn't want to have your expenses ring up with those calling cards. This was a way to contact people. And remember, this was before the age of WhatsApp and FaceTime and, of course, Zoom, which we can fast forward to 2020 when the pandemic hit. And that was kind of a moment for Skype to like make a comeback of sorts. And it didn't happen at all. This was Zoom's moment and all the other messaging apps that have voice calling as part of it. But Skype was really such a pioneer. And I mean, what happened, do you think, after the acquisition by Microsoft? I mean, this was a big bet. At the time, Skype was on fire. It was, a very popular app. What do you think happened under Microsoft's watch?
It's funny. I actually got a chance to talk with Steve Ballmer about this recently. We had a discussion about Microsoft's 50th anniversary and his reflections, and it was a bit of a preview and a prep session, but also an interview in advance of the March 20th event that we mentioned earlier. And he was the CEO when Skype was acquired. And one of the points he made was that the acquisition was good, the execution was not. And Microsoft had a hard time focusing. They had a product at the time called Lync for businesses, Lync. And they stuck with that product. They ended up splitting their focus. And as a result, I think they did not invest as much in Skype as a brand, as an engineering initiative, as they could have to position it to be what Zoom became, because it certainly could have been what Zoom has become. And by the time the pandemic came around, Microsoft had already at that point moved on with Microsoft Teams. And so that became the big focus. But Microsoft Teams is really baked into Microsoft 365, and Microsoft has that advantage. And so in that way, it doesn't feel like a singular success in the same way that it would have been if Microsoft had been able to truly invest in Skype. I think not only could Skype have become Zoom to the world, but it could have become more like what LinkedIn has become for Microsoft as this standalone, successful brand that was acquired and flourished under Microsoft. Skype did not do that. I think you can make the case that LinkedIn has. And for all these reasons, you kind of look back on it and go, that was a really big missed opportunity by Microsoft to have a huge brand in this whole realm of video communications and messaging.
When you open your phone and you want to talk to your friend, you don't open Microsoft Teams.
No.
There is a consumer Microsoft Teams, but it's just not even in the lexicon.
Right. And we should say that Microsoft is transitioning that user base to the consumer version of Teams. But you're right. Teams is much more something that I encounter with companies that are bought in on the Microsoft ecosystem. It's much more of a business type of calling platform and video conferencing platform, and not that broad-ranging universal communications system that something like Zoom has become, or WhatsApp. And maybe it is the bifurcation of the business and the consumer markets that's happening here in part, but it seems like Skype had the potential to bridge those two worlds, and Microsoft just did not take advantage of that.
And you look at the acquisitions that happened after that, LinkedIn, as you said, that they seemed really hands-off. I mean, you wouldn't even know Microsoft owns LinkedIn if you were just browsing around on LinkedIn. Nope. And now with Activision, Nuance, and maybe this is under Satya Nadella, the strategy of maybe more hands-off. Let's not touch the acquisitions that we do as much, or get involved, or try to integrate left and right. So perhaps Microsoft could have left Skype alone in a way.
Yep.
Now, would that have led Skype on this path to becoming the dominant way people communicate as WhatsApp and Telegram and FaceTime proliferated? Who knows?
Yeah. Well, it's probably worth a Harvard Business Review case study, and I'm sure actually there has been one. And there's actually a great CNBC documentary, The Rise and Fall of Skype, that we'll link to from the show notes. And it's just one of those cases where you look back and say, boy, that could have been much different. Hey, Taylor, thanks for jumping on for these first two segments.
It was great to be here. Let's go out and enjoy the sun here in Fremont and say farewell to our Googlers down the street.
Absolutely. All right, coming up next, we're going to do a deep dive on Microsoft's quantum initiatives. You're listening to GeekWire. It's Todd Bishop, and I wanted to tell you about a favorite podcast of mine. It's called Booming, and it's a show that has opened my eyes to a whole range of things, Like what's really happening when I scan a digital coupon at the grocery store, and how robots are changing the construction of buildings in downtown Seattle, among many other topics. Booming is a podcast from KUOW Public Radio in Seattle. It's about the economic forces shaping our lives in the Pacific Northwest. It's co-hosted by reporters Joshua McNichols and Monica Nicholsberg. That's a familiar name and voice to longtime GeekWire readers and listeners. They answer questions that listeners are wondering about, like why are sports tickets so expensive? Or how hard should you actually work at work? Plus, every episode ends with a game. That's Booming from KUOW Public Radio. Find episodes on the KUOW app or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm pleased to be joined this week by Chetan Nayak. He is Technical Fellow and Corporate Vice President of Quantum Hardware at Microsoft. Chetan, it's great to talk with you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me on.
Microsoft had a big announcement in the world of quantum computing last week, and I want to dive into that a little bit later on. But this is such a new area for a lot of people that I wanted to give folks a sense for where we're headed before we talk about how Microsoft is hoping to get there. So if this ends up coming to fruition, quantum computing, like you and your colleagues hope it will, what does that future look like? What will quantum computers be able to do?
Thank you very much. That's a really good question. And I can see why it might even be confusing, because sometimes people think that quantum computers are just like the computers today, but much faster. But that's not the case. Quantum computers are going to be really good for some things and not necessarily good for other things. So they aren't going to replace today's computers. The development of computers that we have today, whether it's CPUs, GPUs, and we'll have QPUs, quantum processing units, and they're all going to have different things that they're particularly good at. So quantum computers, you could ask, what are quantum computers really good at? The fundamental thing is they're great at simulating nature, because nature is, at its base, is quantum mechanical. Sometimes those quantum effects aren't so important, aren't so pivotal, and that's sort of what we see in the classical world around us. But there are cases in which quantum effects are very important in many materials, like superconductors and magnets, many chemical reactions, for instance, the catalysts we use for nitrogen fixation to make fertilizer, or in future would use to break up microplastics. So there are many kinds of materials and chemical reactions that are very fundamentally quantum mechanical, but the underlying physics and chemistry really requires you to take quantum effects into account. Those kinds of systems cannot be simulated with a classical computer. And I don't mean that they can't be simulated with like a data center today or all the data centers in the world. Maybe even if you took all the data centers in the known universe, including ours and alien civilization, that still wouldn't be enough. Because if you look at, and that sounds like a joke, but if you take, 1,000, what's called 1,000 logical qubits, which is the kind of problem you might end up having to solve, well, if you want to represent a wave function of that size with classical computers, you would need as many transistors as there are atoms in the entire known universe. So that's the scale. Quantum problems often have a very small compact problem statement. They're small data, but the state space in which you solve the problem is huge. And so that's kind of the fundamental, when Feynman first started thinking about quantum computing and Manin in the Soviet Union around the same time, they were thinking of how do you simulate quantum systems, because they knew that this was something you couldn't really do on a classical computer. Even in the 80s, if they looked out to where we'd be in 2025 or 2125 for that matter, they knew you wouldn't have computers that could directly simulate these problems. You can do approximations, you can use lots of tricks to try to simulate a system or model a system like that, but you can't directly solve it without a quantum computer. On the other hand, there are lots of things we use computers for today that a quantum computer won't be good at all. And so many things that we do and take for granted that classical computers do really well, quantum computers will be slow and clunky for those. So these are special purpose things. Now, that sounds like a niche. It sounds like, oh, you're just talking about some very specialized processor that a bunch of scientists are going to use to simulate chemistry and materials, right? That doesn't sound so great. But then you stop and think, well, 96% of all manufactured goods rely on chemistry and materials. So we think about eras of our civilization as the Stone Age and the Bronze Age and the Iron Age, and now we're in the Silicon Age. We actually, our ability to control and understand and manipulate materials is really fundamental to everything we do. And going forward, if we need catalysts for carbon capture to take carbon out of the atmosphere, nitrogen fixation, I mentioned, it's a 100-year-old process, the Haber-Bosch process, which is very energy intensive. We actually know that bacteria are able to take nitrogen out of the atmosphere and put it into the soil for plants to grow much more efficiently, but not at scale, and so we love to have catalysts that can enable us to do that at scale and high efficiency. So, there's a whole number of things which I think that, our world depends on materials and chemistry that quantum computers would be exciting, would be the way to avoid doing or supplement lots of trial and error experimentation. If we can simulate these things, we could maybe simulate many different materials or compounds or catalysts, select out a few and only test those in the lab. So that's really where I think it's going. I will say, however, having said all that a lot of the excitement in quantum computing kind of got rebooted in the mid-1990s when Peter Shor discovered his algorithm, which showed that quantum computers are good at a very particular type of math problem, which is take a big number, find its prime factors. The difficulty of that problem, the fact that it's hard to find the prime factors, but easy to multiply them together and get the product, is at the heart of a lot of public key cryptography systems. And so there's a lot of interest for cryptography. And quantum computers will necessitate us going to different crypto systems post-quantum cryptography. That's going to be a transition that's going to take some time. So it's a good thing is we've already started. That is one potential use of a quantum computer, but for me, the really exciting ones have to do with what I talked about in chemistry materials.
Is it too much to say that this could solve global warming and cure all disease? Am I going too far with that?
I don't. Yes, of course, but not like it's not totally crazy in the sense that look, I do think that we're going to need ways to get carbon out of the atmosphere, and I hope that someone discovers something tomorrow, even before we have a quantum computer. Obviously, that'd be great. But I do think that a quantum computer potentially gives us a very systematic way to approach problems like that, where through simulation, we can run through a lot of alternatives and find a few maybe that work and then see which are most practical or cost effective. The quote unquote old-fashioned ways of finding these, or I should say the current ways of doing this, look, I hope they pan out. Obviously, because if we have something tomorrow, that'd be great. But I think a quantum computer can be a valuable tool for that specific problem, obviously, but also for a whole host of other similar problems. On the disease side, that involves simulation of chemistry. So it could definitely help us with maybe also on the delivery side, so targeted delivery, as well as finding the drugs themselves.
What happens when you combine quantum computing and artificial intelligence?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, of course, we're not going to know until we play around with it. As you probably know, so much of what we know about artificial intelligence so far has come about from, trying stuff out. And sometimes you have pleasant surprises and things end up working way better than, you ever would have imagined. In my mind, there's a huge, interesting question, which is, and I think the answer is very likely to be yes, but it would be great to do this, which is we can use artificial intelligence. We can build artificial intelligence models that can actually predict some things about materials or chemistry. Okay. But ultimately, those models are only as good as the training data. That's where we are in artificial intelligence. It's only as good as the training data. If you train it on classical data, it's going to, in some sense, emulate the classical simulations that we do, or the experiments that we do, or the classical analytical calculations that we do. If you want your AI to be able to solve these inherently quantum mechanical problems, you should train it on quantum data. And a great source of, you might call it synthetic quantum data, but the best source of quantum data would be a quantum computer, because you actually know what problem you're solving. You can vary parameters. You can really figure out a good way to train an AI on data produced by a quantum computer. And then, you really could have something extremely powerful that combines the best of both AI and quantum computing. If the AI can learn quantum mechanics, I mean, we don't see any reason why it can't. It should be able to, but that's an open question. So the sooner we can test it out, the more exciting.
The fundamental component of quantum computing is something called a qubit. How does that compare to a traditional transistor or processor in computing today?
The basis of today's computers are zeros and ones. A transistor is an on-off switch, which is 0 or 1. A qubit is sort of like Schrodinger's cat, which can be both dead and alive. Schrodinger's cat, Schrodinger's cat can't actually be both dead and alive, but that was his thought experiment. But a qubit can be in a quantum superposition of a 0 and 1. And in order for it to be a qubit and not be like Schrodinger's cat, what you don't want is for it to collapse into either 0 or 1. And Schrodinger's cat, because it's big and macroscopic, and so therefore it interacts with the environment strongly, is the reason that it can't be in a superposition. You want your qubits to be in a superposition state and for that superposition to be preserved for a long period of time. And that's kind of the fundamental difference. And a great deal of the computational power of qubits comes from that fact, which is that they aren't necessarily 0 or 1, but can be in a quantum mechanical superposition like Schrodinger's cat.
And that qubit is the fundamental component. And my understanding of what Microsoft announced last week is essentially a new kind of qubit. And you compared this when we talked previously to the transistor moment for classical computing. In other words, in the past, the qubits have been the equivalent of the vacuum tubes of quantum computing. And now we're in this transistor moment. What's new and different about this new kind of qubit that Microsoft announced?
We've engineered a new state of matter, topological superconductor, or topoconductor for short. And that new state of matter has this very fundamental property that it actually can store information in a way that's just very hard to get at. It's very well protected from the environment. In particular, for a topological superconductor, the number of electrons being even or odd, which is ordinarily very easily distinguished in a superconductor because mostly they want to form pairs and an unpaired electron is penalized. In a topological superconductor, actually it's just fine with an odd number of electrons, that you can't find an unpaired electron anywhere. So we established a new state of matter. So a little bit like in the silicon world, you had to understand semiconductors and silicon first, establish a new state of matter, that engineered a new state of matter. We then built a qubit out of that state of matter and showed first on the path to building that qubit that we could measure the even or oddness, that even though it's well hidden from the environment and almost impossible to observe, it is actually possible under special circumstances, and then use that to build a qubit. So it's a new it's a new type of qubit in which the 0 or 1, that basic binary degree of freedom, is hidden in a way, and in a way that has a lot to do mathematically with topology, which is the study of shapes. It's the usual donut coffee cup joke, or the difference between a Möbius band and an ordinary band. The quantum mechanical wave functions similarly have some topological properties, a twisting of the wave function similar to the Möbius band being twisted, and that twisting has a rigidity to it that actually is very robust against various kinds of perturbations and so on. So it's a new type of qubit that takes advantage of topology to be robust.
And my understanding is that one of the biggest challenges with qubits is that they're very susceptible to noise, in other words, outside interference. And the whole idea of what you discovered and created here is this phenomenon or quasi-particle called the Majorana zero mode. And the whole idea is that it essentially splits the electron into two, and you kind of cover your bases. You're almost, hedging your bets, because if one of those sides gets perturbed, you've still got the other one, and the qubit still remains stable. Am I on the right track?
Yeah, so indeed, it relies on Majorana zero modes. This topological superconductor, it relies on Majorana zero modes. They're at the end of one of these wires. And I should also say that when there's an odd or an unpaired electron, it gets shared between, it's hard to say, we're trying to use English words to describe something, mathematical equation, so It's a little hard to say split, but it's at least shared between the two ends of the wire. And as a result, if I look at one end of the wire, I actually can't tell if there's anything there. And if I look at the other end, I can't tell. It's only if I, in a very specific way, look at both ends together in a correlated way that I can tell whether there's an electron there or not. And that is the fundamental property here of Majorana, what are called Majorana zero modes, or Majoranas for short, that you can hide in a pair of them. You can hide an extra electron, and that is what gives this qubit its robustness.
And my understanding is that Microsoft, through your research, you've been able to show that you're not only able to observe but control these Majorana particles, which were previously only theorized, and so that was kind of the key breakthrough there.
That's right. Make them on essentially on demand. Be able to reproducibly make them, measure and control.
I know that one of the established ways of making qubits is basically the notion of trying to overcome this susceptibility to errors through volume. And Google made an announcement with its Willow chip along these lines last year, where they're just trying to essentially take this prior version of qubit, use it in enough volume that it tends to overcome the errors. But my understanding is that what you're doing at Microsoft is essentially trying to address those errors and make the qubits more reliable in the first place.
Yes, that's right. So we believe that scaling up to large numbers of qubits is something that we want to do after we've made our qubits very reliable. So we actually have a path to make our qubits more and more reliable, even at the single qubit level or few qubit level. The path to doing that is by taking advantage of this topological phase. By making it more robust, it has an energy scale called the gap or topological gap. The more we are able to crank that up, the better this qubit becomes. So that's a very specific single parameter metric of device quality that as we crank it up, the qubit gets better and better, and that enables scaling.
That's good on the technical deep dive, and that may be as far as I can go, Jathan. But bottom line, my understanding is that this notion of a functional quantum computer was for many years thought to be decades away, and that your assessment is that now with these breakthroughs, it could potentially be years away.
Yeah, we've done a very serious exercise of planning our roadmap out to the first fault-tolerant, useful quantum computers. And actually, we've signed a contract with DARPA to deliver one of these. That contract came after a couple of years of engagement with DARPA, where they had their scientists, in some cases embedded in our labs, looking at our measurements. They examined our architecture, our engineering plan, budgets, hiring plans, supply chains, the whole thing involved in building a machine that can do this stuff. And after that long period of evaluation and very careful evaluation with a huge number of scientists that they hired to do this, we entered into a contract with them. The full details I can't disclose, but it's a pretty serious machine that we're going to deliver on a pretty aggressive timescales, the way I put it. We think it's more years than decades.
When the news came out, and I reported on the news and many others reported on the news, there was immediately a bunch of questions that came out from researchers looking for more data from Microsoft. I mean, you published a paper in Nature, and there were different nuances to the different components of the announcement. But overall, there were some researchers who were saying they didn't believe it yet, that they're waiting for further proof that Microsoft has created this topological qubit and that you've discovered these Majorana zero modes can actually exist. How would you address those questions?
Yeah, I think, look, first of all, skepticism is healthy, definitely. And it's a normal part of science. When you hear something new, you should be a little skeptical and then, dive deeper and look at the evidence more. So I think that makes a lot of sense. Also, I don't necessarily expect every skeptic to, on the same day, decide, I'm not skeptical, I've learned something. I think that's something that probably happens over time. Because, at the end of the day, our goal is to build a working, useful quantum computer that can solve these difficult problems. And as we go along this journey, we have to make more and more complex devices that are more and more robust. And I think as we do that, you can still be skeptical, but as you see each, milestone as we go along the way, I think it's just harder and harder. You can still, cook up reasons to be skeptical and to be doubtful. But I think it will just get harder and harder the further we move along our roadmap, along both the device complexity and system complexity, which means capabilities, and along the robustness, which means the qubit specs. And as we move along both axes, I think it'll just be harder and harder for people to be skeptical. But you need some people to be skeptical. That's a normal part of science. We are very, very convinced of our results. Yeah, I mean, I understand that there's skeptics, but and that's healthy. But our results are extremely solid. We just published a paper in Nature. We have follow-up work that we just presented at the Station Q meeting in Santa Barbara. So the big, conference that we run almost every year in Santa Barbara. It was last week. We had over 100 experts from around academia and industry there. We presented our results there. The feedback was overwhelmingly positive and honestly very excited. I'm going to be giving a talk on this work at the American Physical Society Global Summit in March. It's the 100th anniversary this year of quantum mechanics, so this is a big conference. Schrödinger discovered his equation in 1925, so it's 100 years on. So that will be really exciting. We've got another paper forthcoming. So we're putting a lot out there in talks and presentations and publications that I think will convey a lot of the evidence that has had us pretty convinced for a little while now. And I expect people will be pretty impressed and excited when they see this stuff.
There was an editor's note on the peer review file that I'm sure you saw. It said, just so folks out there know what it said, that they wish to point out that the results do not represent evidence for the presence of Majorana zero modes. The work is published for introducing a device architecture that might enable fusion experiments using future Majorana zero modes. Would you disagree with that?
Well, no. I mean, the purpose of the paper was to establish this readout method, because as I said, the main purpose of the paper was we need to be able to read out even or odd. Now, a previous paper of ours showed that we actually, a 2023 paper showed that we could, with pretty high confidence, actually get the topological phase of Majorana zero modes, but not without loopholes, meaning you could look at the data and say, well, maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but we were able to quantify that. So it wasn't just, loose, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. What we actually quantified was that at the 95% confidence level, if we saw something that passed this protocol, the topological gap protocol, then it was 95% likely, or better, in some cases 97% likely to be Majorana. So it's a quantifiable thing that obviously we all love to have binaries, yes or no, but the reality is it's a certain confidence level. When you take that paper in combination with the Nature paper, and we said this in the paper, is that, well, actually, it could be something that's not Majorana, but it would require a fine-tuning of certain parameters in the model to be 0 to less than within a nano electron volt. So, of course, that's still not definitive proof. You could have a model where those things are tuned to that level, but I think just as a quantitative statement, I think it's fair to say it's virtually impossible for those things not to be Majorana zero modes. So you never want to say 100% certainty, but the tolerance, the level of quantitatively how much we said this in the paper in multiple places, yes, it could be not topological, but boy, the quantitative limitations on some other explanation are really, really tight. So I think that's how I would summarize the whole situation, is that, yeah, skepticism is good. I think it will always be possible to find an alternate interpretation of our data, but it's getting increasingly hard because you really have to tune things to within the NREV level to make it happen. So I think that's why we're so confident in what we're doing. And for us, what is the confidence level you need to be? You need to be confident enough to go to the next step. And if you're successful with the next step, it becomes even harder to argue not on the right path. And we've done that. That's what we presented at the Station Q meeting. That's the topological qubit that I'm going to be talking about in the American Physical Society meeting in March, and we have a paper forthcoming on that as well. So, stay tuned. I think there's a lot more evidence coming out from our development that even further fleshes out the things that you've heard about.
You're a longtime theoretical physicist. Microsoft has been pursuing this dream for 19 years. As you've mentioned, it's the longest running current research and development project inside the company. What does this moment mean to you and the team?
It's really exciting. No, it's a great moment for the team, because so much hard work is paying off right now. If you just think about the things that I just talked about, well, we had a 2-year engagement with DARPA in which, we showed them our roadmap and our plan and all of the data, much of it unpublished. Actually, we opened up many things that are proprietary secrets that we wouldn't talk about outside, but we could, under NDA, discuss with the U.S. government, who knows how to keep these kind of secrets. So it was a long process before we entered into this contract. And the contract's a big deal, right? To build something like this for the government, is really important. The paper I just mentioned, which just published in Nature, being able to, it was definitely one of those awe-inspiring moments, the first time we could see 0 and 1, corresponding to, the difference between like 10 million and 10 million 1 electrons, in one of these devices. And then the qubit and the Majorana 1 processor that we unveiled to the world last week, similarly, those have been, stages of really spine-tingling discovery when those devices first came out of fab and when some of the first measurement results came. So it's been, really exciting.
Well, I'm looking forward to continuing to follow this. I do feel like I'm kind of getting an education in this along the way. So I appreciate your patience with all the questions, and I appreciate you answering and keeping us posted here. So Chethan Nayak, thank you very much for joining me.
Awesome, Todd. Thank you very much. I appreciate the time. Bye-bye.
Chethan Nayak is Technical Fellow and Corporate Vice President of Quantum Hardware for Microsoft. Later in the week, Amazon had some big quantum news of its own, announcing its own chip that takes a different approach. You can find links in the show notes to more information and to all of the stories that we discussed on this week's show. Editing this week by Curt Milton. I'm GeekWire co-founder Todd Bishop. We'll be back next week with a new episode of the GeekWire podcast.